if your dog pulls like crazy, which is very common, right? You just have to put him in his place behind you and the issue will be gone. Or will it? In today's episode of A Dog Soul, an empath's guide to your dog's feelings, we will talk about Django, who pulled like a freight train, but the assertive leadership thing Mom did to put him behind her actually made things so much worse, even if it cured the pulling. So we will find out why this happened and how we fixed it. So stay tuned and have fun. Alright, so Django was a 2.5-year-old livestock guardian dog cross greyhound something. So he was a multi-mix, but those two breeds kind of stuck out, a Marimano and a greyhound. And his issues ranged from pulling like crazy, escalating at other dogs, getting scared when guests came over, and at some sound. So he had multiple issues, right? And his parents had learned to force him behind them during the whole walk, which was about an hour. But that didn't fix anything for him. So on the surface, it seemed to work, but all the other issues got so much worse. So today we will focus on the pulling and how the position he was put in affected the other part of their lives. But if you want to know more about the other topics, tell me in the comments or write me an email, depending on where you're watching, and I'll be happy to include them in another podcast episode. But for now, let's focus on the pulling, right? Because it's really, really common. Now, they lived in a very heavily wooded area with many dogs, and he was bitten twice. He was very young, right? But he already got bitten twice. Once in their neighborhood, in the woods, on a very narrow path, and the other dog just showed up. And once in class at a local dog school. Now, this is something that actually shouldn't happen, but sometimes when the arousal gets too high and things get out of hand, it seems to happen. I get those cases more frequently lately, so yeah. Now, that explained partially why he was so over the top aroused outside and so stressed, and it kind of explained the reactivity, but not in total, right? It wasn't the whole story. So that was part of his pulling. The other part was related to hunting, so smells and sights. That means that in the woods, his pulling was worse than when they were walking next to a street or somewhere else. Now, this is a very interesting clue because hunting, pulling, reactivity, sound sensitivity, all of these issues are related to stress, and they get worse when stress levels are higher. So sometimes all of them, and sometimes only the ones that are breed-specific things. So if you have a greyhound, it is very probable that the hunting gets worse. If you have a guard dog, it's very likely that barking at the fence gets worse. Pulling and reactivity are not breed-specific, and they very often get worse too. So this was what told me that we had to work on his stress level. We had to do stress reduction first. Now, this is a good idea for every dog. So if you see your dog having any kind of issues, or if your dog's just annoying, do a stress reduction. It helps in most cases. Sometimes dogs are pretty chilled already, and there is just one little thing that won't go away. But in most cases I see, we do need a stress reduction. And very often, this is something that needed to happen yesterday. It's so important, and very often we don't need that much training. And you will see later on that this is also something we saw with Django. So I got videos of him walking in his position at the back, and you could see that his face was all wrinkles. He had such an intense stress face. The eyes were huge. You could see the whites so easily. His whole body was extremely tense, and he had real trouble coordinating his legs in that slow pace. This is also something that happens very often if we keep our dogs very close to us, because we are a lot slower, especially on narrow wooden paths that have some obstacles in them and go down in a very steep angle, right? So we slow down on these paths, and the dogs, they would, but they would still be a lot faster than us. So if we put them in such a position, it stresses them. And if this goes on for such a long time, I mean 1 hour of intense concentrations to even coordinate the legs, right? It was taking a toll on him. And this continued at home. But having the dog behind you has more disadvantages than just stressing out the dog. You cannot see people or dogs approaching, right? So they meet the reactive dog first. And with Django, it was the same way. He did show some signs before he escalated, but Mom couldn't see them because he was behind her. Now, he got triggered out of the blue, or so it seemed. It wasn't out of the blue, we found out later. But again, you just can't see in the back of your head, right? You also can't see wildlife, right? So you cannot see what your dog does. And for Django, he sometimes got scent of some kind of trail, right? Some kind of wild animal. So he would stop abruptly or walk in a different direction. Mom didn't see that. So she walked ahead, and they had a very short leash. And whenever the leash ended, there was a pop. Now, Django was on a harness, so this wasn't as bad, but it threw him off balance again. So another challenge for his coordination, right? Now, we already talked about how this affected his stress levels, right? So what we saw was the pulling outside got better because he was behind, right? So he couldn't pull, but his barking at home spiked. So this got worse. And his reactivity got worse as well. So what we did was we started with a stress reduction and mostly on walks. So I asked them to let him walk in the front and use a much longer leash. Now, this was a little bit scary for Mom in the beginning because he was a big dog, right? And she worried about not being able to hold him whenever he started chasing after something. But we tried it and we attached 2 leashes. I had one, she had another, so we were 2. And she realized that it was really no issue. She could hold him fine. Now, if you're alone and you cannot have the 2 leashes with 2 people, you can also try a bungee leash attached to your normal leash, because those are like shock absorbers, right? And they protect your joints whenever the dog runs into the leash pretty quickly. Now, for reactive dogs, those aren't ideal because they can get closer to the other dog, even if the leash is tense. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But for the hunting thing, it's fine. Now, what the front position and the longer leash did for Django was that he finally could sniff. And sniffing in itself often takes a lot of the stress out of the walk and out of the dog. So that is another thing I would recommend whenever we have a very stressed dog, to encourage him to sniff. Now, we might use treats for that, right? Scatter some treats and see if your dog wants to sniff a little bit more after the treats are gone. And also teach the dog that, yes, we can stop on walks to do some sniffing. Now, some dogs have to learn that, right? And also, this is a natural need for dogs. Sniffing, exploring, choosing the dog's own pace, because having movement restrictions is really frustrating for us as well, right? If we hit a traffic jam and we're stuck in traffic, it gets our frustration levels up. And that is stressful for dogs as well, right? So a longer leash and exploring in his own pace takes the movement restriction away a little bit. Not entirely, and we will come to a fix a little bit later. But what it also does is that mom could see danger early enough. So the wooded area wasn't ideal because in a very densely wooded area, you cannot really see dogs approaching early on. But it makes it a little bit better if they either come from behind and reach you first, or they come from ahead and you can see them approach your dog. This is something that gives us as humans a little bit of peace of mind, right? But also we can see our dogs. We can see whenever our dogs get tense, and we can see them start getting into the whole reactivity thing. So we can react and start managing the situation better. Now, what we also did was we introduced search games. Again, doing something with the nose is natural for dogs and very often a strong need. So we started indoors. Outdoors was still too stressful for Django, but indoors he could participate. The ultimate goal being, of course, that they could implement them on walks and do something together. But we have to start crawling before we can walk, right? So we did him indoors, also to get him a little bit more tired and happy and things like that. And to strengthen the bond on walks, mom started to show interest in his findings. So whenever he had a spot he wanted to sniff out because maybe a dog peed there, or maybe it was the start of some scent trail of a wild animal, or whenever he stopped to watch stuff, mom would just join him, right? This is something that we can do easily and that starts to create a bond and a sense of connectiveness with our dogs. And I think it's pretty interesting to see what catches our dog's interest, right? And to get him out of the whole hunting all the time thing, they tried different routes as well. There weren't many without woods, but some few were next to the street and things like that. Sometimes they had to drive somewhere to get to a more relaxed area, because next to a street always also means a shorter leash, right? And less opportunity to sniff, depending on what the dog's interested in. My dog is very interested in human smells, in cat poo, and in dog messages, so pee spots and stuff like that. So he finds things to sniff on a street as well. For dogs who are more interested in wildlife, streets don't provide as much to sniff. So getting him to a field where it's an open area so he can watch more and mom can see whenever something's coming toward them, right, was also reducing the stress level. And he could do search games in those areas pretty quickly. So that was the first thing we saw becoming possible with the reduced stress. So he started to participate in search games in specific areas outside. And the ultimate goal was to have him run off leash in non-wooded areas. Because as a greyhound, running was a very obvious need for him. Because whenever he was in somebody else's backyard that was big enough, he would run and run and run and run. And of course, this is a stress thing too, but it is also just a breed-specific need for him. They had a very tiny backyard, so this was not something that would provide a space for Django to run in. And also there were no fenced-in areas they could rent, right? So if you live in an area with sniff spots, those are awesome. They are really great. We don't have them here, which is a shame, right? And there weren't even any dog parks or stuff like that where he could just go in and run and do stuff. So the goal was to have him off leash on fields. But for that, of course, we needed a reduced stress level, we needed a recall and all those things. Now, what we also did, apart from the whole walking thing, was to introduce more licking and chewing at home and stop the whole assertive dominance thing from the parents. What that means is they stopped intimidating him whenever he did something wrong and instead use management, like he barked a lot at the windows, so they installed window films to take away the visual stimuli. And he stopped barking. That helped him relax a lot more. And again, we are at reducing the stress level, right? So more sleep and rest to process all the things he would see outside gets the stress level down overall. Also, they introduced a relaxation ritual in the evening. And this is something very, very nice. So if you don't have a time where you really snuggle with your dog and calm down together, try it. It's really awesome. If both participate voluntarily, it releases oxytocin, which is the binding hormone or the snuggle hormone, or it has many names, and it just builds a connection between mom and child, or between two humans, or between human and dog, or between human and another animal. So it strengthens the bond, right? And we also introduced healthier food. So he ate some crappy kibble before, and some dogs do relatively fine with them, but you see seemingly unrelated issues coming up, like itchiness or farting, or the dog stinks, things like that. Dogs usually don't stink. So if your dog is always stinky, try to switch to a more healthy food. For Django, it was the farting, and his coat also wasn't very shiny. It seemed a little flat, and he was itchy sometimes. He had ear infections sometimes. So the new food was also an elimination diet. Now, this is something that can be a little bit annoying, but we get used to it really, really fast, and it makes a huge difference. Think about if you have a lot of mosquito bites, right? And you're itchy all the time. It's stressful. It's the same thing for our dogs. If they are allergic to something in the food and they are itchy all the time, they get more reactive. They get more tense. And we can reduce those things with switching to an elimination diet and find out what the dog's allergic to and what we can feed without the dog getting itchy all the time, right? So all of these things were just to reduce the stress level so he was able to participate in loose leash walking training. So that might seem like a lot. It didn't take very long. It wasn't even 2 months. So he calmed down more and more, because if we want to start training and we want our dogs to learn something, but the dog's brain is constantly in a fight or flight mode, he can't learn, or at least not as well. Right? So stress reduction first. And what we experienced with him, and I already mentioned that, was that there wasn't much training necessary, right? It wasn't much left of the pulling. Yes, with a shorter leash, he had to learn where he could be around his parents so that the leash stays loose, and what to do if the leash tightens. But he caught up to that very quickly. He understood that, and I saw them a few months later, and they were strolling around on a short leash with no tension and relaxed faces, both of them. So this was something that made me super, super proud of them. And this is something that we see so often. So we start with, oh my God, my dog's pulling like crazy. I have to stop the pulling. I have to do loose leash walking training and all of these things and try different tools and whatever. And what you actually need is stress reduction. So what we can learn from Django's case is the problems we see on the surface are often not what we need to address first. And everything we achieve with force will create problems somewhere else, because force builds up tension, and the built up tension will have to come out eventually. So if one way seems longer but more sustainable, like stress reduction, it will give you a faster relief than the supposed quick fix, like using a prong collar or whatever. And it's a lot more fun, right? We can get to know our dogs completely new, right? We learn about the dog's stress, and we learn that the dog is not so much different from us. So I love to see the transformations. I love to see the dogs start to relax and start working together with the humans. So it's not only stress reduction for the dog, it's also stress relief for the humans, right? Because the dog suddenly becomes the companion we always wanted. And if you're not sure if your dog has a stress issue, and if so, what's stressing your dog, get a behavior consultation. That's what we do. That's why we do what we do. We find out what goes wrong and we fix it together, right? So you don't have to learn all the things by yourself. And you have the link for that in the description. But if you're into learning so many things by yourself, that's a wonderful journey as well. Just takes a little bit longer. So have fun learning, have fun training, and we'll see each other next time. Bye.